Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whatever time you're watching this. I am glad you have joined me. We're going to talk about a little historical background before we get to the Industrial Revolution. So the textbook jumps ahead to the Industrial Revolution before it talks about things that I want to talk about, such as what had made Europe so rich, because Europe's going to continue to grow in wealth and power with the Industrial Revolution, but even before that, how did they become that way? So we're going to talk about two things: overseas empires, so the colonies throughout the world established by major European powers, and then slave trade, which fueled the transatlantic economy. Trans meaning between the Atlantic Ocean economy, oftentimes called triangular trade, or referred to at other times as the Columbian Exchange. So if I'm going to give you a thesis for chapter 16, I would say this: the economies of the major powers of Europe grew enormously as a result of overseas exploration from the 16th to the 18th centuries, the establishment of colonies, and a mercantile system which included dominance politically, socially, economically, and militarily. So that is where we're headed. That's what we're going to talk about. Before we get there, you should have pulled up two documents, or I handed these to you in class. So the first is the online lecture guide, this document, and then the second is a review document right here. And I like this review because it breaks things down into categories. We're going to focus on this economics category here and on three ideas. The first idea, this idea that trade increases during the age of exploration. The main reason being overseas empires or colonies. So here it lists Spanish and Portuguese, but we're also going to look at other major European powers. But the second idea there is the Spanish and Portuguese overseas colonies will be one of our foci. And then the last foci is this idea right here, mercantilism. That's an economic idea that becomes very important during this time. So those are our three major foci. So let's talk about these things. Overseas empires. They began during the Age of Discovery. Columbus sets off in 1492 and sets off the Age of Exploration, and these European countries establish posts and trading routes throughout the world. This is called, what comes next is called the Mercantile Era. These major European powers, the main four, Spain, France, Portugal, and Great Britain, established very large overseas empires. This allows them to become rich through trade and commerce, and it also, I'm sorry, you can't see the very bottom there. Let me see if I can do something about that. Okay, how's that? Better. There we go. Okay, so this also leads to intense competition for land and resources. These countries are trying to grab up land all over the world. Brazil, South America, Canada, North America, the colonies all over what is today the United States. These countries want that land because it means wealth, resources, and money. They also needed to develop huge navies to defend themselves and their colonies. So their own empires in Europe, as well as now their overseas colonial empires throughout the world, they need huge navies to defend these areas. The second topic which we're going to cover today is this idea of slavery. By the end of the 18th century, African slaves in the New World numbered around 10 million. That is not the answer to your math question towards the end of your review guide, just so you know. Americas, colonies of France, England, Spain, and Portugal. That's the areas that they control. So the Americas and other parts of the world, these countries, France, England, Spain, and Portugal, start to control. Plantation system, this is what they used to make their money, to gain wealth. European colonists control slaves, produce huge crops, cotton, sugar, and tobacco being the most important crops. For example, sugar plantations on Saint Dominique. As you're going to read about, sugar becomes very important not just for the rich, but for every European's diet. And the French control parts of the Caribbean. Saint Dominique, which is modern day Haiti, was under their control. Tobacco plantations in Virginia under the control of the British or the English. And cotton plantations in the southern British colonies, Virginia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, those areas that become famous for cotton. Those are all examples of plantation economies that develop. So mercantile empires. Spain controls most of South America, with the exception of the Portuguese controlling Brazil. And Spanish also control southern parts of North America, Florida, Mexico, California, and Southwest. We learned about last year Cortez coming in, conquering Mexico, and Pizarro coming in and conquering Peru, and then them establishing themselves in parts of Southwest, what is today the United States, Arizona, New Mexico, California. And the British control the 13 colonies, which is the original 13 states eventually, once they rise up and rebel against the British and lead the American Revolution. But at this point, they're considered 13 British colonies. Islands in the Caribbean, they also are into the sugar business, and ports in India. And France controls area in North America, especially areas in the north, Canada and Ohio and the Mississippi River, and they gain their wealth mostly through the fur trade. Beaver pelts and deer pelts and bear and things like that make the French rich. So what is mercantilism exactly? If you were given a direct definition, it would be the government heavily regulates trade and commerce to bring national wealth. So European powers, their main concern was the economic well-being of the home or the mother country. So their overseas empire, the main goal was to send money back home. Grant. Yes. Sorry. My roommate wanted her charger back. So, chapter 16. Yes, yes. Okay. And how they did this? Well, basically, natives and African slaves suffered greatly under this European economic idea of mercantilism because they needed a major labor source to bring wealth back to the mother country. Here's a look at the breakdown. Portuguese, Spanish. We didn't talk about the Dutch, but they control a very small overseas empire in South Africa and parts of South America. And then the French, as you can see, they're in northern Canada. The 13 British colonies here. And the Portuguese have control of Brazil, which is why Portuguese is the native language of Brazil. And then the Spanish have a very large empire throughout North and South America at this point. So mercantilism, who benefits, who suffers? Take a look. Mother country, benefit. Large plantation owners, benefit. African slave traders. So you got to understand that the African kingdoms also, they benefited from this. And you'll see that more in a video in a second. European businesses connected, cotton mills, textile factories, slave traders, they all benefited. And on the other end of the spectrum, who suffers? Poor colonists who lose businesses and lives. So not all European colonists come to the New World and get rich. Many suffer and struggle and don't make it in business. Slaves forcibly taken from Africa. Native population, so nearly 90% by some estimates, died because of disease, mistreatment, and war. So the native population suffers a great deal. Let's look at the history of slavery for a second. It's a long history. It goes back before the Romans and Greeks. It's not a new thing. There were even white slaves at one point in parts of Europe and Asia and Africa. The Ottomans banned this after they conquered Constantinople in 1453, but that did happen for a time. Portuguese then began to import slaves from West Africa after the Age of Exploration begins, and from this point forward, slaves become vital to European economies. So they're the labor force behind the biggest business and their overseas empires. So Black America, the reason Black America is what it is today is because of this history. So part of that history is the I would say one of the ugliest parts is called the Middle Passage, and this is the journey from America or from Africa to Americas for the slaves. And in terms of business, it was what the Europeans needed for their labor stores, and in terms of the actual passage, it was an awful time period. The sailors, the captains, European captains, treated the slaves horrible. They were thrown in awful situations and mistreated. Many people died of disease, dysentery, and abuse during this time. So here's a depiction of that idea. The slave quarters were very small. They were thrown together. Sometimes they were stacked, literally piled on top of each other, which you can see in this picture here. This is a picture of how they might be arranged on a ship, and this is an actual picture from the time period. They're lined up, and literally at times they're piled high to get as many slaves as they could on board, because the Europeans viewed slaves as a commodity, as a business item. So triangular trade. European, what they would do, they would oftentimes take guns and other goods to Africa to trade for slaves. So they go from Europe to Africa and they trade them manufactured goods. So finished products like guns and rum and other products. And then they take the slaves from Africa over to the colonies, to their colonial empire, where they take what the plantation economies here have been creating, so cotton and sugar and more sugar in Brazil and tobacco in Virginia, and they take that unfinished product, what we call a raw material, back to Europe to the factories where it would be finished, and then they repeat the process. So that's essentially the triangular trade. Slaves were traded for and thrown on ships across the Atlantic, taken to the West Indies, where they would be exchanged for raw materials, and then raw products taken to Europe to be converted to products, finished products like rum, molasses, smoking tobacco, textiles, and the process would repeat itself. By the numbers, if you add these up, these total numbers you get, I'll let you answer that. But this chart shows a list of things that were being traded: rice, sugar, cotton, coffee, tobacco, and the number of slaves coming from West Africa from 1650 to 1860. Review. And I want to show you a short video. Sorry, I forgot to show you. So before we review, I'd like to show you a short video about the African slave trade.
If we talk about slavery, we can talk about institutions that have existed for millennia.
Slavery wasn't invented when Europeans discovered Africa. Slavery is as old as civilization itself. Whether it was in ancient Egypt, whether it was in ancient Greece, whether it was in ancient Rome, or in Senegal, Ghana, Nigeria, and Angola, slavery has been a constant in human history.
What we need to remember, I think, is market mechanisms, supply, demand, warlords who are willing to supply, and slave traders who supply the demand. This is something that happens all over the world, and it happened in very large numbers in West Central Africa when the Portuguese first came. When Europe encounters Africa in terms of slavery, they encounter indigenous systems of captive labor or slavery. And so there's a way in which they are able to tap into existing networks and gain slaves. But there's a very important distinction to be made in terms of the forms of captive labor that Africans participated in with each other versus what would become the Atlantic slave trade.
in Africa, slaves were taken because they were seen as a threat. They were oftentimes casualties of war. So you'd take the other tribes' men as casualties of war because they were seen as a threat. He's saying in the Atlantic slave trade, slaves were seen as less than human, and that's a big difference between African slavery that already existed and the Atlantic slave trade. Was this dehumanization of slaves, no longer viewing them as humans but as products. Whoops.
And I did this disservice to produce products. In other words, to increase wealth. Slavery was a business. It was an investment. It was a part of the economy. To own a slave was to own a valuable commodity. The industrialization of slavery is something that's new to the history of the
Sorry,
that period.
I just figured out I can color.
They were economic.
Okay, back to where we were. My apologies.
Key to whatever enterprise you use them for. The African slave trade was a conspiracy, unfortunately, between avaricious Europeans and avaricious African elites. Without the two working in harmony, the slave trade could not possibly have manifested itself in the way that it did. It's one of the most horrendous, painful moments in modern human history.
Whoops. Alright, so there's a short overview of the slave trade. Last thing, review. So we covered overseas empires of France, England, and Spain developed during the 16th to the 18th centuries in the Americas. Mercantilism was the main economic principle, bringing wealth and resources back to the mother country. And all of this is done on the backs of native labor at first, and then slave labor lastly. Final thing, your secret word for the quiz. Secret word for the quiz is delta. That's delta, like a triangle. D-E-L-T-A. Delta. Last thing, additional review. Read pages 530 to 531. A slave trader describes the Atlantic Passage, and be ready for a review quiz of that reading and the entire lecture. This is Mr. Kinman signing off. Have a great rest of your day.